At my husband's celebration dinner, he thought it'd be hilarious to toast me like this. Meet my wife. No ambition, no plan, just living off my success. Everyone laughed. I didn't. I smiled, raised my glass and said, enjoy it. This is the last joke you'll ever make at my expense. Then I walked away, quietly reclaiming my peace. Meet my wife. No ambition, no plan, just living off my success. Those were the words my husband William spoke into a microphone at Marchand Restaurant, in front of 30 of his colleagues, clients, and executives. He was holding a champagne glass. He was smiling. Everyone was laughing. I was sitting 3 feet away from him, wearing the navy dress I had spent an hour choosing, the one that made me look appropriate for his corporate world. I had my hands folded in my lap. I was not laughing. Before we continue, I want to thank you for being here and sharing stories that matter. If you believe that invisible contributions deserve recognition and that dignity should never be negotiable, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps these stories reach more people who need to hear them. Now let's see what happened next. 15 years. That is how long I had spent building the invisible foundation that allowed William Hamilton to become the youngest senior vice president in Ashford Capital's history. 15 years of late nights editing his presentations. 15 years of hosting dinner parties where I memorized which clients preferred single malt scotch and which ones needed their egos carefully stroked. 15 years of strategic advice he presented as his own thinking, of household management that freed him to work 80-hour weeks, of social networking he later claimed as his own relationship-building genius. And in one toast, in front of everyone who mattered in his professional world, he reduced all of it to nothing. No ambition. No plan. Just living off his success. I am Zoe Hamilton. This is the story of how I stopped being invisible. But I need to go back. I need to explain how I became someone who could be erased so completely that my own husband believed the erasure was truth. I need to tell you about the 15 years that led to that microphone, that toast, that moment when everything I had built came crashing down around me. It started small, the way these things always do. When William and I married, I was 28 and working in event planning for a corporate firm. I was good at my job. I understood how to read people, how to create experiences that made clients feel valued, how to manage the 1,000 small details that separated a successful event from a forgettable one. William was a junior analyst at Ashford Capital with ambition that burned brighter than his actual position. He worked long hours, came home exhausted, and talked endlessly about the career he was going to build. We were partners then, or at least I believed we were. We talked about his work and my work. We made decisions together. We split household responsibilities in ways that felt fair and balanced. But when William got his first major promotion and started traveling 3 weeks out of every month, something shifted. We had what seemed like a practical conversation about logistics. Someone needed to be home. Someone needed to manage the apartment, pay the bills, make sure we had food in the refrigerator and clean clothes in the closet. I was making decent money, but William's salary had just doubled. It made financial sense for me to step back from my career temporarily. Temporarily became 6 months. 6 months became a year. A year became permanent so gradually I did not notice it happening until it had already happened. I told myself I was making a strategic choice. William's career had momentum. Mine could wait. We were building something together, and sometimes building together meant one person held the foundation while the other person climbed. I would have my turn later. Right now I was investing in our future. But investment requires acknowledgement of value, and acknowledgement was something that disappeared so slowly I did not realize it was gone until much later. I became the person who knew everything about William's professional world without officially existing in it. I learned that Richard Pemberton, William's boss, was a man who responded to personal connection more than professional competence. He had a daughter named Catherine who competed in equestrian events, and if you asked about her competitions with genuine interest, Richard would talk for 40 minutes and leave the conversation feeling warmly toward you. I made sure William asked about Catherine. I made sure he remembered details from previous conversations so his questions seemed authentic rather than strategic. I learned that the Lewiston account, one of Ashford Capital's most valuable clients, was managed by a man named Tom Grayson who had a wife obsessed with antique jewelry. When we hosted the Graysons for dinner at our home, I wore a vintage bracelet I had inherited from my grandmother and made sure to mention its history. Mrs. Grayson spent an hour examining it, asking questions, and by the end of the evening she was inviting me to join her at an estate sale the following weekend. That dinner translated into Tom Grayson requesting William specifically for his next investment portfolio review. I turned our home into a strategic asset without ever using that language, without ever demanding credit. The dinner parties I hosted were not just social occasions. They were carefully orchestrated opportunities where William's colleagues and clients relaxed, formed personal connections, let their professional guards down. I planned menus that impressed without seeming pretentious. I made sure conversations flowed naturally, that no one felt excluded or bored, that everyone left feeling like they had spent the evening somewhere special and that William was someone worth knowing better. And late at night, after the guests left and the dishes were clean and the house was quiet again, I sat with William at our dining table and helped him with his real work. He would pull out his laptop and walk me through presentations he was preparing for the board. I would read his proposals and point out where his arguments were weak, where his tone was too aggressive, where he needed more data to support his conclusions. I had a gift for seeing how other people would react to his ideas, for understanding when he needed to soften his approach or when he needed to push harder. He started asking for my input on everything. Every major pitch. Every client proposal. Every negotiation strategy. I remember the night before his presentation on the Thornfield merger, the $40 million deal that would eventually make him senior vice president. It was 2 a.m. and he called me from Denver in a panic. The board was not buying his risk assessment. Richard Pemberton thought he was overselling the upside. The whole deal was falling apart. I got out of bed and opened my laptop. He sent me his presentation and I spent 3 hours rebuilding his argument. I found the places where his confidence had made him sloppy. I restructured his financial projections so they sounded less risky to conservative investors. I softened his language in places and strengthened it in others. At 5 a.m, I sent him the revised version. He called me back 20 minutes later. His voice was filled with relief and gratitude. He told me I had saved him, that he did not know what he would do without me, that I was the reason any of this was possible. I remember feeling warm with pride, believing absolutely that we were partners, that his success was our success, that the foundation I was building mattered even if my name never appeared on any company document or press release. I genuinely believed that. I believed it when I helped him prepare for meetings. I believed it when I hosted his clients and laughed at their jokes and made them feel important. I believed it when I managed every detail of our household so he could work 80-hour weeks without worrying about whether we had toilet paper or whether the bills were paid on time. I believed it when I gave up my own career ambitions because his career had more momentum and more financial potential. I believed it right up until the moment he stood at Marchand Restaurant and told 30 people I had no ambition and no plan and I was just living off his success. The afternoon before that dinner, I had spent an hour getting ready. I chose the navy dress because it was elegant without being flashy, appropriate for his corporate world without trying to compete with it. I did my makeup carefully. I reviewed my mental notes about which colleagues would be attending, which clients I needed to make feel special, what topics to avoid and what questions to ask. This was not new to me. This was what I had been doing for 15 years. William came home that afternoon with energy that told me the deal had closed. His face was flushed. His tie was loosened. He had that look he always got when something big happened, like he had just conquered something important and the world needed to recognize it. He told me about Thornfield signing that morning. $40 million. The youngest senior vice president in Ashford Capital's history. He was proud and excited and already thinking about the celebration dinner, about who would be there, about what this meant for his career trajectory. He kissed me quickly, distracted, his mind already moving to the next thing. I felt proud of him. I genuinely did. I knew how hard he had worked for this merger. I knew because I had been there for every moment of doubt, every late-night revision, every panicked phone call when he thought it was falling apart. I had been his strategist, his editor, his sounding board. I had rebuilt his arguments and softened his tone and found the weak points before his critics could. I had earned this celebration too, even if my name would never appear on the press release. But standing in our bedroom that afternoon, holding that navy dress and watching William type urgent messages on his phone, I felt something I could not quite name. Something quiet underneath the pride and anticipation. Something that whispered that I had become invisible in my own marriage, that my contributions only mattered when William needed them and disappeared from memory the moment they were no longer immediately useful. I ignored that whisper. I had been ignoring similar whispers for months, maybe years. Small moments that should have alerted me to shifting dynamics but which I explained away because acknowledging them would have meant confronting uncomfortable truths I was not ready to face. William had started introducing me as just my wife at business functions rather than by name. He made dismissive jokes about my lack of formal career, comments that stung but which I laughed off to avoid seeming oversensitive. I had noticed him restructuring our finances, moving investments into accounts in his name alone. But when I questioned this, he explained it was for tax optimization, and I accepted the explanation because I trusted him. He had stopped asking my opinion on work matters as frequently. He had stopped crediting me when clients mentioned how much they enjoyed our dinner parties. He had stopped seeing me as anything more than domestic logistics, the person who made sure his life ran smoothly so he could focus on what really mattered. I ignored all of it because I had invested 15 years in this partnership. And acknowledging that the partnership had become one-sided would have meant admitting those 15 years were not what I thought they were. It would have meant confronting the possibility that I had erased myself so gradually and so completely that even I had started to believe I was not really contributing anything of value. But that night at Marchand, standing in front of 30 people who mattered in his professional world, William made it impossible for me to ignore anymore. He reduced 15 years of invisible labor, strategic thinking, and genuine partnership to a punchline. No ambition. No plan. Just living off his success. And everyone laughed. The valet took our car and William placed his hand on the small of my back, guiding me toward the entrance of Marchand like I was a piece of luggage that needed directing. The gesture looked affectionate from the outside. It felt like management. The restaurant was exactly what I expected from the photographs William had shown me earlier. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings so high they created their own weather system. The walls were covered in fabric that probably cost more per square foot than our monthly mortgage. Every surface gleamed with the kind of polish that required full-time staff to maintain. The other guests were already arriving, men in dark suits that fit too perfectly to be off the rack, women in dresses that whispered expensive rather than shouted it. I recognized most of the faces from previous firm events. There was Richard Pemberton near the bar, William's boss, holding what I knew without asking would be single malt scotch. His wife Margaret stood beside him wearing diamonds that caught the chandelier light and threw it back in sharp little bursts. The Lewiston account team had arrived, Tom Grayson and his wife Sandra, who I had bonded with over antique jewelry at a dinner party I hosted 8 months ago. The junior partners clustered near the entrance, their body language showing they understood this dinner had hierarchy and they were at the bottom of it. William was energized in a way I had not seen in months. He moved through the room with confidence that bordered on ownership, shaking hands and clasping shoulders and laughing at jokes that probably were not funny but served a social purpose. I followed slightly behind, smiling and nodding, playing the role I had perfected over 15 years of these events. Margaret Pemberton approached me first. She looked at my dress with the kind of assessment that took less than 3 seconds but recorded every detail. Her smile was polite and empty. "Zoe, how lovely to see you. That dress is charming." Very understated. Understated was code for not expensive enough, but I had learned years ago that responding to these small cuts only made them deeper. I smiled back with equal emptiness. "Thank you, Margaret. You look stunning as always." She touched her necklace with practiced modesty and launched into a story about the charity auction where Richard had bought it for her. I made appropriate listening noises while my attention drifted to William across the room. He was talking to Richard now, both men holding their drinks and standing in that particular way successful men stand when they are discussing important matters. Richard said something and William laughed too loud, the kind of laugh that was meant to signal agreement rather than actual amusement. A woman appeared at my elbow. Rebecca Chin, one of the few female colleagues at William's level. She was younger than me, maybe 35, with sharp intelligence in her eyes and none of the artificial warmth the other corporate wives projected. "Zoe, right? We met briefly at the summer retreat." I remembered her. She had been kind in a genuine way, asking about my background in event planning instead of immediately dismissing me as just someone's wife. "Rebecca." "Yes. How are you?" "Surviving." She glanced around the room with an expression that suggested she found this whole performance as exhausting as I did. These dinners are always such a production. Everyone performing their corporate roles like we are all in some very expensive play. Her honesty was startling and refreshing. I found myself relaxing slightly. It does feel a bit theatrical. That's a diplomatic way of putting it. She sipped her wine and watched William and Richard across the room. Your husband is having quite a moment. The Thornfield deal was impressive. Very aggressive strategy, but it paid off. I felt that familiar flicker of pride mixed with something more complicated. I wanted to tell her about the 3-hour revision session at 2 in the morning. I wanted to explain that the aggressive strategy had originally been too aggressive, that I had been the one to find the balance between confidence and reassurance that made the board comfortable enough to approve. But that would have sounded like I was taking credit for William's work, and women who did that at these events were labeled as bitter or delusional. He worked very hard for it, I said instead. Rebecca looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. There was something in her eyes that felt like recognition or maybe sympathy. I'm sure he did. The dinner began with the kind of coordination that required significant staff and planning. We were guided to a private dining room where a single long table had been set with more silverware than any meal reasonably required. Place cards directed us to our seats. I was positioned in the middle of the table, far enough from William that we could not have a conversation but close enough that I could watch him. Rebecca was seated across from me, which felt like a small mercy. The appetizers arrived. They were tiny architectural achievements that looked like they had been assembled with tweezers under a microscope. I ate mine in 2 bites and immediately regretted not savoring it longer because I was still hungry and the next course was probably 30 minutes away. The conversation around the table flowed in the predictable patterns of corporate dinners. Market analysis, competitor movements, industry trends, professional victories that were recounted with strategic modesty designed to sound humble while ensuring everyone understood exactly how impressive the achievement had been. The men dominated the conversation. The women smiled and nodded and occasionally contributed observations that were polite enough to be heard but not substantial enough to interrupt the real business discussion. I had nothing to contribute to any of it. Not because I lacked knowledge or opinions, but because speaking up would have required explaining how I knew what I knew, and that explanation would have made William uncomfortable. So I stayed quiet and watched and felt myself becoming more invisible with each course that arrived. Richard Pemberton barely acknowledged my presence when he greeted William earlier. He had looked past me like I was part of the furniture, his attention entirely on William and the congratulations he wanted to deliver. It was not personal, I told myself. Richard simply did not register people who did not matter to his professional objectives, and I did not matter because I had no title or position that made me relevant to him. But it felt personal. It felt like confirmation of what I had been sensing for months, that I had become nothing more than William's wife, a descriptor rather than a person, an accessory that was occasionally useful for social events but fundamentally unimportant. The main course arrived. The conversation continued its corporate trajectory. And then William stood up. The table fell silent immediately. 30 people turned their attention to him with the kind of focus that important men command when they decide to speak. William held his champagne glass and smiled with confidence that looked natural because he had practiced it so many times it had become natural. I smiled too. I was proud of him in that moment, genuinely proud despite everything I was feeling. He had worked hard for this. We had worked hard for this, even if only one of us would be acknowledged. I expected the standard speech. Gratitude for the team. Recognition of hard work and dedication. Maybe, if I was fortunate, a mention of the support system that made his success possible. Some vague acknowledgement that behind every successful man was someone holding up the foundation. William started speaking. His voice carried easily across the room, comfortable with attention and authority. I want to thank everyone for being here tonight to celebrate what has been an incredible journey. The Thornfield merger represents not just a business achievement, but a validation of strategy, persistence, and vision. He paused for effect. People nodded. Richard raised his glass slightly in approval. I could not have done this alone. I had support along the way. My heart lifted slightly. Maybe he was going to acknowledge me after all. Maybe in front of all these people who mattered in his professional world he was going to recognize that partnership meant something, that my contributions were real even if they never appeared on any company document. William turned toward me. He was still smiling. His eyes met mine and something in his expression made my stomach tighten with warning I did not fully understand yet. I want to introduce you all to my wife, Zoe. He gestured toward me like he was presenting evidence in a trial. 30 pairs of eyes shifted to me. No ambition, no plan, just living off my success while I do the real work. The words landed with physical force. My brain tried to process what I had just heard, tried to find some interpretation where those words meant something other than what they clearly meant. But there was no other interpretation. William had just reduced 15 years of invisible labor, strategic advice, and genuine partnership to a punchline. He had just told everyone in this room that I was worthless. Time did something strange. Each second stretched impossibly long while somehow everything happened too fast to stop. I watched faces around the table react in stages. First confusion. Then uncertainty about whether this was meant to be funny. Then as they looked at William and saw he was still smiling, still holding his glass like he had just delivered a clever toast, they decided it must be acceptable humor. The laughter started quietly. Nervous chuckles from people unsure if they were allowed to laugh at this. Then it grew louder as more people joined in, gaining confidence from each other. Richard Pemberton laughed the hardest, throwing his head back like this was the funniest thing he had heard in months. He wiped his eyes with his napkin. Around the table, people were laughing with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some looked uncomfortable but were laughing anyway because not laughing would have been worse, would have created awkward tension and marked them as not understanding corporate humor. Others seemed genuinely amused, like William had made an observation they all secretly agreed with. I sat completely still. My hands were folded in my lap. I could feel my face doing something but I had no idea what expression I was wearing. My throat was so tight I could barely breathe. Every eye in the room was on me now, waiting to see what I would do. Would I laugh along and prove I was a good sport who could take a joke? Would I crumble into tears and confirm I was as weak and sensitive as they probably suspected? Would I explode with anger and give them all a story to tell tomorrow about the crazy wife who could not handle a little humor? Something inside me that had been bending for 15 years, accommodating and adjusting and making itself smaller to fit the space William allowed me, finally snapped. But it did not snap into rage or tears or any of the reactions they expected. It snapped into absolute clarity. I saw myself exactly as these people saw me. Invisible. Unimportant. Existing only as an extension of William's identity. Relevant only when I served some purpose for him. I saw the woman I had become, the one who accepted scraps of recognition and convinced herself that was partnership, who apologized for taking up space, who had erased herself so completely that even her own husband believed she contributed nothing of value. And in that moment of brutal clarity, I made a choice that would change everything. I reached for my wine glass. The movement was deliberate. I wrapped my fingers around the stem of the wine glass and lifted it slowly enough that conversations around me faltered and died. The crystal caught the chandelier light. 30 faces turned toward me with expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort to anticipation of whatever scene I was about to create. I raised the glass higher until it was level with my eyes. I looked directly at William across the table. His smile had frozen in place, uncertainty starting to creep into his expression as he realized something was happening that he had not scripted. My voice came out steady and clear. Not loud, but carrying easily across the silence that had settled over the room. Enjoy it. This is the last joke you'll ever make at my expense. I took a sip of the wine. It was excellent, probably cost more than I had spent on groceries in a month, and I was not about to waste it. I set the glass down with careful precision, the base touching the table with barely a sound. Then I picked up my clutch from where it rested beside my plate, pushed my chair back and stood. The room was so quiet I could hear fabric rustling as people shifted in their seats. I smoothed my dress, adjusted the strap of my clutch over my shoulder and walked toward the exit. Not running. Not storming out with dramatic fury. Just walking with the kind of calm that comes from finally making a decision you should have made years ago. I did not look back at William. I did not acknowledge Richard Pemberton or Margaret or any of the colleagues who had laughed at my expense. I simply walked through the dining room, through the main restaurant where other diners looked up from their expensive meals, through the ornate lobby, and out the front entrance into the cool evening air. Outside, I stopped under the elegant awning that stretched over the sidewalk. My hands were shaking now, adrenaline flooding my system in waves that made my fingers tremble and my heart pound against my ribs. But underneath the physical response was something steadier. Something that felt like certainty. I pulled out my phone and opened a new note. If I was going to dismantle my old life and build something new, I would do it with intention and strategy rather than emotional chaos. I had spent 15 years applying precision and planning to William's career. Now I would apply those same skills to my own future. I typed 4 rules with the same methodical attention I had once used to manage William's schedule. Rule 1. Do not respond to his text tonight no matter what he says. Rule 2. Document everything. Every contribution, every sacrifice, every invisible hour. Rule 3. Protect what is mine. Rule 4. Never again confuse being supportive with being invisible. I read the rules twice, then opened my ride app and requested a car. The driver was 7 minutes away. I gave the address for Clara's apartment, the one place I could think clearly without William's presence contaminating my decision-making process. The car arrived exactly on schedule. I climbed into the back seat and gave the driver a small nod of thanks. He did not ask questions or make small talk, which I appreciated more than he could possibly know. I watched the city pass outside the window, lights blurring together as we moved through traffic, and felt the first real breath I had taken in hours fill my lungs completely. Clara's apartment building was a modest 3-story walk-up in a neighborhood that prioritized character over luxury. I climbed the stairs to her second-floor unit and knocked quietly. It was nearly 10 o'clock. She might already be asleep. The door opened within seconds. Clara stood there in pajama pants and an old college sweatshirt, her hair pulled back in a messy knot. Her expression shifted from surprise to immediate concern when she saw my face. She did not ask what happened. She just stepped aside and pulled me into the apartment, closing the door behind me. She guided me to the couch, disappeared into the kitchen, and returned with a glass of water that she pressed into my hands. "Drink," she said, sitting down across from me in the armchair she had inherited from our grandmother. I drank. The water was cold and helped ground me back in my body. Clara waited with the patient attention she had perfected over years of teaching middle school students who needed time to find their words. "William made a toast at the dinner," I said finally. My voice sounded strange, distant, like it belonged to someone else. "In front of 30 people from his firm. He introduced me as his wife with no ambition, no plan, just living off his success." Clara's expression did not change, but her hands tightened on the arms of the chair. "Everyone laughed," I continued. "His boss laughed the hardest. And I just sat there realizing that William actually believes what he said. He genuinely thinks I've contributed nothing. That everything he's built, he built alone." The words kept coming then, spilling out faster than I could control. I told her about the years of gradual erasure, about how my contributions had been systematically diminished until even I had started believing I brought nothing of value to the marriage. I told her about the late nights editing his presentations, the client relationships I had managed without credit, the strategic advice he had presented as his own thinking. I told her about the financial restructuring I had noticed, the accounts being moved into his name alone, the property deed I had been removed from without discussion. My voice broke several times, but I pushed through. I needed to speak these truths aloud to someone who would not minimize them or explain them away or tell me I was being too sensitive. Clara listened without interrupting. When I finally stopped talking, exhausted and emptied out, she leaned forward and spoke with the kind of clarity that came from seeing something obvious that everyone else had missed. "You've been his chief operating officer for 15 years without the title or compensation. Everything he built stood on infrastructure you maintained. It's time to send him an invoice." The metaphor landed with unexpected weight. He was right. I had been performing a job without acknowledgement, building systems and relationships and strategies that William had taken credit for because I had never insisted on recognition. I had convinced myself that partnership meant not keeping score, that love meant supporting without expectation of return. But what I had been calling partnership was actually exploitation. What I had been calling love was actually erasure. "I walked out," I said. I raised my glass and told him that was the last joke he'd ever make at my expense. Then I just left. Clara smiled for the first time since I had arrived. It was a fierce smile, proud and satisfied. "Good. What are you going to do now?" I did not have a complete answer yet, but I had the beginning of one. "I'm going to make sure he understands what he lost. I'm going to document everything I contributed and make sure it gets recorded somewhere he can't erase it." Clara stood up and moved to sit beside me on the couch. She put her arm around my shoulders and I leaned into her, feeling the support that came from someone who loved me without conditions or expectations. "You can stay here as long as you need," she said. "Guest room is yours. We'll figure this out together." I spent that night in Clara's guest room, lying awake while my mind raced through calculations and memories. Around midnight, my phone started buzzing with incoming text. I had silenced the ringer, but I could see the screen lighting up repeatedly on the nightstand. I picked it up and read through the messages without responding. William, midnight. Where did you go? Why did you leave like that? William, 12:15. You're overreacting. It was a joke. Everyone knew I was joking. William, 12:30. This is ridiculous. You embarrassed me in front of my colleagues. Come home so we can talk about this like adults. William, 1 o'clock. I don't understand why you're being so dramatic. You made a scene for no reason. William, 1:45. You're being irrational. This is exactly why people don't take you seriously. William, 2:30. Fine. Stay wherever you are. But this is childish and you know it. The messages continued through the early morning hours, escalating from confusion to irritation to anger. But the one that arrived at 3 o'clock was the most revealing. William, 3 m. You're embarrassing me in front of my colleagues. They're asking questions I shouldn't have to answer about my own wife. This reflects badly on both of us. Come home and we'll figure out how to handle the damage you caused. I read that message 3 times, studying every word. His embarrassment mattered. My humiliation did not. My absence was the problem. His public degradation of me was just a joke I had taken too seriously. The damage I had caused by leaving was worse than the damage he had caused by reducing 15 years of partnership to a punchline. The message told me everything I needed to know about how William saw our marriage, our partnership, and me. I did not respond to any of the texts. Instead, I forwarded all of them to my email address, creating the first entries in what would become a comprehensive documentation of everything that happened after that dinner. Then I opened a new note and began making lists. Every client relationship I had managed. Every presentation I had edited. Every dinner party that led directly to business opportunities. Every piece of strategic advice I had offered that William later presented as his own insight. Every sacrifice I had made to free him to work 80-hour weeks without worrying about domestic logistics. I wrote until my hands cramped and the sky outside began lightening with approaching dawn. When Clara knocked softly on the door around 7 o'clock, I had filled pages with detailed, specific, dated examples of contributions that William had erased from his narrative of success. Clara brought me coffee and sat on the edge of the bed while I showed her what I had been working on. This is evidence, she said, scrolling through the lists on my phone. This is proof that you weren't just supporting him. You were building his career alongside him. I need a lawyer, I said. The decision had crystallized overnight. I need someone who can help me make sure this gets recorded somewhere official. Somewhere William can't just dismiss or erase. Clara nodded slowly. Do you know anyone? I thought about the various attorneys I had met over the years at William's business functions. Most of them were corporate lawyers who would probably side with William automatically. But there was one person who had stood out, who had given me her card years ago and told me to call if I ever needed help. Janet Morrison, I said, remembering the conversation at a firm retreat 3 years ago. She specializes in family law. She told me once that she wished more women would advocate for themselves before situations became impossible. I found Janet's number in my contacts and called before I could second-guess the decision. The phone rang 4 times and I was preparing to leave a message when a warm voice answered. Janet Morrison. This is Zoe Hamilton. We met a few years ago at an Ashford Capital retreat. You gave me your card and told me to call if I ever needed help. I need help. There was a brief pause, then Janet's voice came back calm and unsurprised, as if she had been expecting this call for years. I remember you, Zoe. Tell me what happened. We arranged to meet that afternoon at a cafe called Riverside Commons, a place I chose deliberately for its complete lack of corporate polish. The tables were scarred wood that had absorbed years of coffee rings and laptop heat. The chairs did not match. The floor was concrete. The lighting came from mismatched fixtures that looked salvaged from different decades. No one from William's world would ever set foot in a place like this, which made it perfect for what I needed to discuss. Janet arrived exactly on time, carrying a worn leather portfolio that suggested years of use. She was in her late 40s, her dark hair pulled back in a practical knot, wearing a blazer over jeans that managed to look both professional and approachable. She ordered black coffee from the counter and sat across from me with the kind of presence that made me feel simultaneously nervous and safe. Tell me everything, she said, pulling out a tablet and stylus. Start with last night. I recounted the dinner at Marchand. The toast. The laughter. My decision to walk out. William's escalating text messages through the night. As I spoke, Janet took notes without interrupting, her expression neutral but her attention completely focused. When I finished, she set down her stylus and looked at me with a directness I had not been prepared for. "What do you actually want from this situation, Zoe?" The question caught me off guard. I had been operating purely on wounded dignity and instinct, moving from moment to moment without defining any clear objective beyond making sure William understood he had hurt me. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I just know I can't go back to how things were." "That's a starting point, but it's not enough." Janet leaned forward slightly. "Do you want reconciliation? Do you want divorce? Do you want financial compensation? Do you want him to suffer? I need to understand what outcome would make you feel like justice was served." I sat with the question, letting myself actually think about what I wanted instead of just reacting to what had been done to me. The answer began forming as I spoke, crystallizing into something clear and specific. "I want recognition," I said slowly. "I want accounting for what I contributed. I want acknowledgement that I wasn't just living off his success but actively building the foundation that made it possible. I want him to understand that what he took credit for was built on work I did without compensation or acknowledgement." Janet nodded and began typing notes on her tablet. "That's actionable. Recognition means documentation. Accounting means financial analysis. Acknowledgement means creating a record that can't be disputed or erased." She looked up at me. "We approach this strategically. First, we document your contributions with specificity and evidence. Second, we examine the financial structure of your marriage to understand what assets exist and how they've been controlled. Third, we consider what leverage you have beyond legal channels." That last point made me pause. "What do you mean, beyond legal channels?" "Courts are slow and expensive and emotionally exhausting," Janet explained. "Sometimes the most powerful pressure comes not from judges but from reputation and professional consequences. Your husband works in a world where image and relationships matter. If we can demonstrate that his professional success was built partly on your unpaid labor, that creates pressure points that a lawsuit alone might not achieve." The idea felt both strategic and slightly dangerous. But I had walked away from safety when I left that restaurant. There was no going back to comfortable denial. "What do I need to do?" Janet pulled up a document on her tablet and turned it toward me. "We build a case. You're going to become a detective investigating your own marriage. I need evidence of every contribution you made to William's career. Emails, text messages, calendar entries, witness statements if possible. I need documentation of client relationships you managed, presentations you edited, strategic advice you provided. I need a timeline of social events you hosted and what business outcomes resulted from them. Can you do that?" I thought about the years of emails still sitting in my account, the texts I had never deleted, the calendar I had meticulously maintained to coordinate William's professional and personal life. "Yes, I can do that." "Good. We'll also need to examine your financial records completely. Bank accounts, investment portfolios, property deeds, credit cards, retirement accounts. Everything. I want to understand exactly how money has moved in your marriage and whether William has been restructuring assets in ways that exclude you." The meeting lasted 2 hours. By the end, I had a clear assignment list and a follow-up appointment scheduled for 2 weeks later. Janet walked me to the door and put a hand on my shoulder. "You're doing the right thing," she said. Walking away took courage. Making sure you're treated fairly in the aftermath takes a different kind of courage. You have both. The next 2 weeks became an intensive investigation of my own life. I sat at Clara's dining table with my laptop and began methodically gathering evidence. I started with email, searching for key terms and client names, building folders organized by category and date. I found the email thread with Tom Grayson from the Lewiston account, where I had followed up after the dinner party at our home to send Sandra information about the antique jewelry estate sale we had discussed. Tom had responded thanking me for connecting with his wife and mentioning he was looking forward to working more closely with William on upcoming portfolio reviews. That dinner party had directly resulted in increased business, but William's name was the only one that appeared on any company documentation about the account relationship. I found dozens of emails where clients responded to invitations I had sent, thanking me specifically for making events welcoming and comfortable. Several mentioned they valued the personal connection they felt with William because of the relationships I had facilitated. None of this appeared in any official record of William's professional achievements. I found the presentation files William had sent me over the years, always late at night, always with urgent requests for feedback. I had saved my edited versions with track changes showing exactly what I had revised. Strategic recommendations William had implemented without crediting where they originated. Risk assessments I had softened or strengthened based on my understanding of how conservative his board members were. Financial projections I had restructured to emphasize different aspects depending on the audience. I created a detailed calendar reconstructing 5 years of social events I had hosted or organized. Next to each event, I noted which clients or colleagues attended and what business outcomes followed within the subsequent 6 months. The pattern was undeniable. My social infrastructure directly correlated with William's professional advancement. The documentation took hours each day, but the work felt important in a way nothing had felt important in years. I was building proof that I had mattered, that my contributions were real and measurable and valuable. Each piece of evidence was another brick in a foundation that William could not dismiss or explain away. The financial investigation was more disturbing. Working with Janet, I requested statements and documents from every financial institution where William and I had accounts. What I discovered made my stomach turn. William had been systematically moving money for at least 18 months. The joint checking account we both contributed to and drew from had been drained to less than $2,000 while a new account in only his name showed deposits totaling over $80,000. The investment portfolio we had supposedly built together over 15 years now had only his name on the ownership documents. When I checked the property records for our vacation home in Colorado, the place where we had spent anniversaries and celebrated promotions, I discovered my name had been removed from the deed 8 months ago. I sat in Janet's office staring at bank statements and property records spread across her conference table, feeling physically sick. "This is financial abuse," Janet said bluntly. She did not soften the term or offer euphemisms. "He's been preparing to marginalize you financially for quite some time. This wasn't impulsive. This was calculated." The evidence transformed something fundamental in how I understood my marriage. Walking out of that restaurant, I had still held some hope that William's toast was a moment of poor judgment, that perhaps confronting him with how deeply he had hurt me might lead to genuine apology and change. But the financial records showed intentional preparation to exclude me, actions taken long before the dinner toast. This was not a mistake. This was the culmination of systematic erasure. "What are my options?" I asked. Janet organized the documents into neat stacks, her movements precise and methodical. "We can pursue this through family court, which will take months and be emotionally exhausting but will ultimately result in equitable division of assets. Or we can create pressure through other channels that might achieve resolution faster and with less public exposure." "What kind of pressure?" "Your husband works at a firm that values reputation and professional relationships. If we can demonstrate to his employer that his success was built partly on your unpaid labor, particularly work involving client relationships, that creates professional liability concerns for them. Firms don't like discovering that their employees have been taking credit for work performed by uncompensated family members. It raises ethical questions and potential legal exposure." I looked at the evidence we had gathered, thinking about the woman I had been 2 weeks ago who would have been horrified by the idea of involving William's employer in our personal problems. But that woman had been willing to accept invisibility in exchange for peace. I was no longer that woman. "I want him to understand consequences," I said. "I want accountability even if it has to be public." Janet smiled, and I recognized the expression of someone who had just received permission to execute a strategy she had been carefully formulating since our first meeting. "Then let's make sure he understands exactly what he lost when you walked out of that restaurant." Janet spent the next 3 days crafting the letter with surgical precision. We met twice more at her office to review drafts, refining language until every sentence carried maximum impact without sacrificing professional tone. She understood instinctively that emotion would weaken our position, that what we needed was documentation presented with the same cool authority William used in his own business communications. The final version was 3 pages. The first page outlined my contributions to William's professional success with specific examples, dates and measurable outcomes. It detailed the dinner party where Richard Pemberton first mentioned the Thornfield merger possibility, noting that I had hosted the event, facilitated the conversation, and created the relaxed environment where business opportunities naturally emerged. It referenced the 2 o'clock morning phone call when William panicked about his board presentation, documenting how I had restructured his risk assessment and softened his language to make conservative investors comfortable. It listed client relationships I had managed, including Tom Grayson from the Lewiston account, with email evidence showing how my personal connection with his wife had translated directly into increased business for Ashford Capital. The second page presented the financial evidence with the same clinical detachment. Bank statements showing systematic transfer of funds from joint accounts to accounts in William's name alone. Property records documenting my removal from the Colorado vacation home deed. Investment portfolios that had been restructured to exclude me from ownership despite being built with money from our marriage. Each piece of evidence was dated and cross-referenced, creating an undeniable pattern of financial marginalization. The third page contained the proposal. I wanted formal recognition of my contributions through appropriate financial settlement that reflected both equitable division of marital assets and compensation for business development work I had performed without acknowledgement or payment. The letter concluded with a deadline. William had 1 week to respond to the proposal, after which we would be forced to make this information available through legal proceedings that would necessarily become part of public record. The letter was addressed to William with copies to Richard Pemberton and 2 other senior partners at Ashford Capital. It was neither emotional nor accusatory in tone. It read like a business proposal, which made it more powerful because it treated my contributions as professional work rather than wifely duty. We scheduled delivery for Thursday morning at 9 o'clock, timing it to arrive during the weekly executive leadership meeting. Janet arranged for certified mail to ensure official receipt and create documentation of delivery. Then we waited. Thursday morning, Janet and I met at a different coffee shop, this one closer to her office. My phone sat on the table between us, volume turned up so we would hear it ring. Janet worked on other case files while I tried to drink tea that tasted like nothing because my mouth was too dry with anticipation to register flavor. The call came at 10:15. William's name appeared on my screen and my hand shook slightly as I picked up the phone. Janet nodded encouragement. "Hello, William. What the hell are you doing?" His voice was tight with barely controlled fury, each word clipped and hard. "You can't send letters to my firm about our private marriage. This is insane, Zoe. You've completely lost perspective." I let the silence extend for 3 full seconds before responding. Janet had coached me on this. The power of not rushing to fill uncomfortable quiet. "You made our marriage public when you used me as a punchline in front of 30 of your colleagues," I said, keeping my voice level and calm. "I'm simply providing context they didn't have at the time." "Context?" He was sputtering now, anger giving way to panic. "You're trying to destroy my career over a joke that everyone understood wasn't serious. Richard is furious. The partners want to know what this is about. You're making me look incompetent." "That doesn't work for me," I said, using the phrase Janet had taught me. The words felt powerful in my mouth, simple and clear and requiring no justification. "You have 1 week to respond to the settlement proposal. After that, we proceed through formal channels." "Zoe, wait. We can talk about this. Just you and me without lawyers and letters and all this drama you're creating. Come home and we'll work this out like adults." I almost laughed at that. Adults. As if I was the one who had behaved childishly by refusing to accept public humiliation with grace. "The proposal is clear. You have 1 week." I ended the call before he could continue arguing. My hand was shaking harder now, adrenaline flooding my system in waves that made my whole body tremble. But underneath the physical response was something solid and certain. I had done what needed to be done. Janet reached across the table and squeezed my hand once, firmly. "Well done. That was perfect." That evening, I received an email that surprised me more than William's phone call had. The sender was Rebecca Chin, the colleague who had offered me a genuine smile at the Marchand dinner. The subject line read simply, "Thank you." I opened it with curiosity mixed with caution. "Dear Zoe, I hope it's okay that I'm reaching out. I heard through firm channels that you sent a letter documenting your contributions to William's career. I don't know the details and I'm not asking for them. I just wanted to say that watching you walk out of that dinner with such calm conviction gave me the first real hope I've felt in years. I've been in a similar position in my own marriage. My husband regularly minimizes my accomplishments and takes credit for ideas I contribute. I've told myself it doesn't matter because we're partners and partnership means not keeping score. But watching you refuse to accept that narrative made me realize I've been lying to myself. Would you be willing to meet for coffee? Not to talk about your situation with William, but to talk about how you found the strength to advocate for yourself when everything in your life was telling you to stay quiet. I understand if you'd rather not. Either way, thank you for showing me what dignity looks like. Rebecca. I read the email 3 times, feeling something shift in my understanding of what had happened at that dinner. I had thought my walkout was purely personal, a private decision about my own marriage and my own dignity. But Rebecca's email revealed that other women had been watching, taking notes, finding courage in my refusal to accept erasure. I replied that evening, suggesting we meet the following week. Her response came back within minutes, grateful and relieved. Over the next several days, William tried multiple approaches to regain control of the situation. The emails started arriving Friday morning, alternating wildly in tone between apologetic and accusatory. Zoe, I'm sorry the joke landed badly. I never meant to hurt you. You know how much I value everything you do for us. Let's talk about this without lawyers complicating things. Then an hour later, you're being completely irrational about this. Everyone at the dinner understood it was humor. You're the only one who took it seriously, which says more about your insecurity than anything I said. Then that evening, I can't believe you're trying to destroy my career over this. After everything I've provided for you, this is how you repay me? By making me look incompetent in front of my firm. I forwarded each email to Janet without responding to any of them. The pattern was clear. William was cycling through different manipulation strategies, trying to find one that would make me back down. But none of them acknowledged what he had actually done or showed any understanding of why his toast had been so devastating. Saturday afternoon, Clara called me from her classroom where she was grading papers. William just called me, she said without preamble. He wanted me to talk to you to make you see reason. He said you're being vindictive and irrational and he just wants to have a conversation to work things out. What did you tell him? I told him he made his choices and now he has to live with the consequences. I told him that if he wanted you to stay silent about your contributions, he probably shouldn't have publicly announced that you had no contributions worth mentioning. Then I hung up on him. I smiled despite the tension coiling in my chest. Thank you. He's scared, Zoe. I could hear it in his voice. He's not worried about losing you. He's worried about what happens to his reputation and career if people find out he's been taking credit for work you did. That truth settled over me with weight. William's desperate attempts at reconciliation were not about missing me or recognizing my value. They were about damage control. Sunday evening there was a knock on Clara's apartment door. I was in the guest room reviewing financial documents when I heard Clara's voice through the door, firm and unwavering. She doesn't want to see you, William. You need to leave. I just want to talk to her. 5 minutes. Claire, please. This is between me and my wife. Your wife who you publicly humiliated and then systematically excluded from your finances? That wife. Well, if you want to communicate with Zoe, you can respond to the letter her attorney sent. Otherwise, you need to leave before I call the building manager. I heard William's voice drop lower, pleading now rather than demanding. He talked for several minutes, his words muffled through the door but the desperation clear in his tone. Clara remained unmoved. Eventually, I heard his footsteps retreating down the hallway. Clara came to the guest room door and leaned against the frame. He looked terrible, she said. Exhausted. Like he hasn't slept since the letter arrived. Good, I said and meant it. The week passed slowly. Janet and I prepared for the possibility that William would refuse to negotiate, that we would need to file formal proceedings and pursue this through family court. But Wednesday afternoon her phone rang with a call from a number we had been waiting for. She answered on speaker so I could hear. This is Janet Morrison. Ms. Morrison, this is Richard Pemberton from Ashford Capital. I'd like to discuss the matter raised in your letter. Would you and Mrs. Hamilton be available to meet tomorrow afternoon? Janet looked at me across the small table at the coffee shop where we had been waiting, her expression calm but alert. She gestured to her phone still on speaker between us. We're available tomorrow at 2 o'clock, she said into the phone. Where would you like to meet? The Grandview Hotel has conference rooms we use occasionally for sensitive discussions, Richard Pemberton replied. His voice carried none of the jovial confidence I remembered from the dinner at Marchand. Third floor, Laurel Room. I'll have my assistant send you the details. We'll be there, Janet confirmed, then ended the call. She looked at me with an expression that mixed caution and something that might have been satisfaction. This is good. He's coming to us, not the other way around. That means the letter had the impact we wanted. What do you think he wants? I asked. To contain the situation before it becomes a bigger problem. The question is what he's willing to offer to make that containment happen. She closed her portfolio and leaned back in her chair. Tomorrow let me do most of the talking initially. You listen and observe. If he asks you direct questions, answer honestly but briefly. We want to understand their full position before we show our hand. That night I barely slept. I kept imagining different versions of the meeting, different things Richard might say, different ways the conversation could go wrong. By morning I was exhausted but clear-headed, running on adrenaline and the determination that had carried me through the past 2 weeks. Janet picked me up at 1:30. I had dressed carefully in a navy suit that Clara had helped me choose, professional without being aggressive. We drove to the Grandview Hotel in silence, both of us preparing mentally for what was coming. The Laurel Room was exactly what I expected. Neutral beige walls, a conference table that could seat 12 but was set for 4, windows overlooking the city that were too high to provide any real view. The kind of space designed for difficult conversations that needed to happen away from regular office environments. Richard Pemberton arrived exactly at 2 o'clock alone. He was dressed in a dark suit that probably cost more than my car payment, but he looked tired. There were lines around his eyes I had not noticed at the dinner, and his usual commanding presence seemed diminished somehow. He extended his hand first to Janet, then to me. Miss Morrison. Mrs. Hamilton. He paused, then corrected himself. Zoe. Thank you for meeting with me. We sat across from each other at the conference table. Richard folded his hands in front of him and took a breath before speaking. I want to start by apologizing for my behavior at the celebration dinner. I laughed at something that was not funny. I failed to recognize how inappropriate William's comments were, and my reaction gave permission for others to treat the situation as acceptable humor when it was anything but. That failure of judgment reflects poorly on my leadership, and I'm genuinely sorry. The apology sounded rehearsed, but not in a way that made it feel insincere. More like he had thought carefully about what he needed to say and wanted to get it right. I appreciate that, I said quietly. Richard nodded and continued. After receiving your letter, I spent considerable time reviewing the documentation you provided. I also made some calls to key clients and colleagues to better understand the full scope of the situation. He paused, seeming to choose his next words with care. I had no idea you had been so instrumental in building and maintaining several of William's most important client relationships. You weren't supposed to know, I said. That was the point. Something flickered across Richard's face that might have been shame or recognition or both. I spoke with Tom Grayson from the Lewiston account. He mentioned the dinner party you hosted at your home where he and his wife felt genuinely welcomed and comfortable. He said his wife still talks about the conversation you had about antique jewelry. He also mentioned that the personal connection he felt with your family was a significant factor in his decision to increase his portfolio allocation with us. I remembered that dinner party. I had spent 2 days planning the menu and researching Sandra Grayson's interests so I could make her feel valued and heard. William had taken full credit for the relationship strengthening that followed. I found similar feedback from 3 other major accounts, Richard continued. Your name came up repeatedly as someone who made clients feel valued on a personal level, which translated into professional trust. That's not wifely duty, Zoe. That's business development work that would command significant compensation if performed by someone we had hired for that purpose. Janet remained silent beside me, letting Richard present his position without interruption. I could feel her attention absorbing every word, every gesture, every subtle shift in his tone. Ashford Capital values integrity and professionalism, Richard said. What happened at that dinner falls short of the standards we expect from our leadership. More than that, your letter has raised questions about whether we have created a culture that allows people to take credit for work they didn't do, whether that work comes from colleagues or from family members providing unpaid labor. He pulled out a folder and opened it on the table between us. Inside were several documents that he turned so Janet and I could read them. We would like to propose a solution that addresses your concerns while maintaining discretion for everyone involved. This includes you, Zoe. We understand this is a private family matter that became unfortunately public, and we want to respect your privacy going forward. Janet leaned forward slightly, her professional attention fully engaged. What are you proposing? Richard walked us through the documents methodically. The first was a settlement agreement that outlined financial compensation in two parts. The first part represented equitable division of marital assets that William had attempted to restructure in his name alone. The second part was labeled Business Development Consulting Compensation, and represented payment for the client relationship work I had performed over the past 5 years, calculated at rates the firm would have paid an external consultant for equivalent services. The total amount made my breath catch. It was more than I had earned in the last 3 years at my event planning job before I had stepped back from my career. The second document was a formal letter from Ashford Capital on firm letterhead. It acknowledged my contributions to facilitating key client relationships and building the personal infrastructure that supported several major accounts. It was carefully worded to avoid creating legal liability while still providing clear documentation that my work had professional value. The letter concluded by stating it could be used for my professional records should I choose to pursue consulting or business development work in the future. The third document outlined changes the firm would implement. Mandatory training for all senior executives on professional conduct, appropriate boundaries, and recognition of contributions from all sources. The training would include case studies, and Richard acknowledged directly that William's dinner toast would be one of those case studies, though with identifying details removed. There's one more component, Richard said, his voice dropping slightly. This one is more difficult to discuss, but it's important you understand the full picture. He explained that William's behavior had created liability concerns for Ashford Capital. Beyond the personal harm to me, there were professional implications. Client relationships built partly through my unpaid labor raised questions about credit attribution and ethical conduct. The public nature of William's comments at a firm-sponsored celebration created reputational risk. We are not terminating William's employment, Richard said carefully. But the promotion to senior vice president will not move forward as planned. He will remain at his current level with several stipulations. Mandatory executive coaching focused on professional conduct and interpersonal skills. Reduced client-facing responsibilities for 6 months while he completes the coaching program. And clear understanding that any future incidents of this nature will result in immediate termination. Richard watched my face as he explained this, perhaps expecting satisfaction or vindication. I felt neither of those things. What I felt was something quieter and more complicated. Recognition that consequences had weight. That actions mattered. That institutions, when presented with clear documentation of harm, sometimes actually responded. William is aware of these terms? Janet asked. He's been informed. He's not happy about it, but he understands the alternative was termination. He signed the acknowledgement this morning. Janet looked at me, a silent question in her eyes. I knew what she was asking. Was this enough? Did this represent the recognition and accountability I had asked for? I thought about the woman I had been at that dinner, sitting in her carefully chosen dress while her husband reduced 15 years of partnership to a punchline. I thought about the documentation I had spent 2 weeks gathering, proof that I had mattered even when everyone acted like I did not. I thought about Rebecca's email and the realization that my refusal to accept erasure had given other women courage to examine their own situations. I want one addition, I said, speaking directly to Richard for the first time since he had outlined the proposal. The training you're implementing for executives. I want to be involved in developing it. Not publicly, not in a way that identifies me. But I want input into what gets taught about recognizing invisible labor and giving credit where it's due. Richard looked surprised but nodded slowly. That can be arranged. Your perspective would actually be valuable in making the training more effective. Janet pulled out her own folder and made notes on the documents Richard had provided. We'll need to review everything in detail before my client signs anything. But preliminarily, this addresses the major concerns we outlined in our letter. How long do you need for review? Richard asked. 72 hours, Janet replied. We'll have a response to you by Monday morning. Richard stood and we followed. He extended his hand again, first to Janet, then to me. When he shook my hand, he held it a moment longer than strictly necessary. For what it's worth, Zoe, I think what you did took considerable courage. Walking out of that dinner, sending that letter, refusing to let this be dismissed as just a misunderstanding. Not many people would have the strength to advocate for themselves that clearly. I met his eyes and saw something there that surprised me. Not just professional respect but genuine recognition of what I had done and what it had cost me to do it. "Thank you," I said simply. After Richard left, Janet and I sat back down at the conference table. She pulled out her tablet and began making detailed notes while the conversation was still fresh. "That went better than I expected," she said without looking up from her typing. "Significantly better. They're taking this seriously because they're genuinely worried about the legal and reputational implications." "Is the settlement fair?" I asked. She looked up at me then, her expression serious. "It's more than fair. It's validation. They're acknowledging your work had monetary value, not just emotional significance. That matters, Zoe. That's what you asked for, recognition and accounting. This is both." We left the hotel and sat in Janet's car in the parking garage for a few minutes before driving back to her office. I stared out the window at concrete pillars and fluorescent lights and felt something shifting inside me. Not happiness exactly. Not triumph. Something quieter and more fundamental. For 15 years I had been invisible, my contributions erased as quickly as I made them. And now a firm full of powerful people had put their acknowledgement in writing, had attached monetary value to work they had benefited from without recognizing, had implemented consequences for the person who had treated my labor as worthless. It was not everything. It did not undo the years of erasure or the humiliation of that toast. But it was something real and documented and permanent. "What are you thinking?" Janet asked quietly. "I'm thinking about the woman I was 3 weeks ago," I said. "The one who would have been terrified to send that letter because it might make William angry or damage his career. I don't recognize her anymore." "Good," Janet said, starting the car. She deserved better than what she was accepting. Janet spent the weekend reviewing every clause of the settlement agreement Ashford Capital had proposed. She called me Saturday evening with minor revisions she wanted to request, technical language adjustments that would strengthen my position without fundamentally changing the terms. By Monday morning, she had sent our response to Richard Pemberton confirming we would accept the settlement with the specified modifications. The final signing was scheduled for Wednesday afternoon at Janet's office. William would need to be present to sign the marital asset division portions of the agreement. Janet suggested we keep the meeting brief and focused purely on documentation, treating it like the business transaction it had become rather than an opportunity for emotional processing. I arrived 15 minutes early and sat in the small conference room adjacent to Janet's main office. The walls were lined with law books that probably never got opened anymore now that everything was digital, but they created an atmosphere of authority and permanence that felt appropriate. I had dressed professionally again, the same navy suit I had worn to meet with Richard, armor that made me feel competent and in control. William arrived exactly on time. I heard his voice in the reception area, formal and clipped as he spoke with Janet's assistant. Then the conference room door opened and he walked in and I was startled by how different he looked. He had lost weight. His suit hung slightly loose on his frame in a way that suggested the weight loss had happened quickly and recently. There were shadows under his eyes that makeup could not quite hide. His usual commanding presence, the confidence that had always preceded him into rooms, seemed diminished. He looked smaller somehow, like something essential had been removed and he had not yet figured out how to compensate for the absence. Janet entered behind him and closed the door. She gestured for William to sit across from me at the conference table, positioning herself at the head where she could observe both of us. "Thank you both for being here," Janet said, her tone professionally neutral. "We have 3 documents that require signatures today. I'll walk through each one briefly before we proceed." She laid out the papers in front of us, explaining the marital asset division agreement, the business development compensation acknowledgement, and the formal letter from Ashford Capital. William listened without looking at the documents, his attention fixed on me with an expression I could not quite read. When Janet finished her explanation and asked if we had questions, William spoke for the first time. "Why are you doing this, Zoe?" His voice was quiet, genuinely confused rather than angry. Janet started to intervene to redirect the conversation back to the documentation, but I held up a hand to stop her. "You destroyed what we built when you decided my contributions were invisible," I said, keeping my voice steady and calm. I'm simply ensuring they get recorded accurately before we close the books on this marriage." "It was a joke," William said, but without the conviction he had put behind those words in his earlier text messages and phone calls. "I didn't mean it the way you took it. You meant exactly what you said. You believe I contributed nothing of value. You believe your success is entirely your own creation. And when my letter documented how wrong that belief was, you were more concerned about protecting your career than acknowledging the harm you caused." William looked down at the documents spread on the table between us. His hand moved toward them, then stopped, hovering uncertainly. "Everything I built, everything we built, this is just destroying it." "No," I said, and I felt Clara's observation about my voice being different crystallize in that moment. I was not apologizing or qualifying or softening. I was simply stating truth. "You destroyed it the moment you decided I was worth less than a laugh from your colleagues. I'm just making sure the destruction gets documented properly." For the first time I saw genuine understanding cross William's face. Not acceptance, not agreement, but recognition that I was not coming back. That no amount of apology or negotiation would restore what he had carelessly demolished with that toast. His hand trembled slightly as he picked up the pen Janet offered him. He signed each document with movements that looked mechanical, his signature less fluid than usual. When he finished, he set the pen down and looked at me one more time. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I didn't know you were doing all of that. I thought you were just managing the house. I didn't realize it was work." The admission hung in the air between us. Part of me wanted to ask how he could have been so blind, how 15 years of partnership could have left him so completely unaware of what I contributed. But I realized the question did not matter anymore. His ignorance was not my problem to solve. "How you know," I said simply. Janet walked William to the door after he signed the final document. I heard them speaking briefly in the reception area, Janet's voice professional and firm as she outlined the next steps for transferring assets and finalizing paperwork. Then the door closed and he was gone. Janet returned to the conference room and sat down across from me. "How are you feeling?" "Lighter," I said, surprising myself with the accuracy of the word. Like I just set down something very heavy that I'd been carrying for a long time. 2 days later, I met Rebecca for coffee at a small shop near her office. She had suggested meeting during her lunch hour, carving out time from a schedule that she admitted was too full to be sustainable. When she arrived, she looked polished and professional in a way that I recognized from my own years of performing competence while feeling invisible underneath. We ordered drinks and found a table near the window. For the first few minutes, the conversation was awkward, both of us uncertain how to begin. Then Rebecca set down her coffee and spoke with sudden directness. "My husband told me last night that I should be grateful he tolerates my career." Those were his actual words. Tolerates. Like my work is some annoying hobby he has to put up with rather than the thing that pays half our bills. The words spilled out of her then, stories that mirrored my own with different details but the same underlying pattern. Her husband taking credit for ideas she contributed during their conversations about his business. Making dismissive comments about her salary being unnecessary since he earned more. Suggesting that her career stress was self-inflicted because she could just quit if the work was too demanding. Treating her professional accomplishments as threats to his identity rather than celebrations they could share. "Watching you walk out of that dinner gave me the first real hope I've felt in years," Rebecca said. "Not hope that things would magically get better, but hope that I could actually do something about it. That I didn't have to just accept being diminished." We talked for 2 hours, well past when she needed to return to work. I found myself sharing not just what had happened but what I had learned about documentation and boundaries and recognizing your own worth. I gave her Janet's contact information and told her about the process of building evidence that could not be dismissed or explained away. By the end of the conversation, Rebecca had made lists on her phone of contributions she had made to her husband's business, financial accounts she needed to examine, conversations she needed to document. She looked different when she left, like something had shifted in how she carried herself. "Thank you," she said before walking back to her office, "for showing me what it looks like to refuse erasure." That weekend I had dinner at Clara's apartment. She had made pasta with too much garlic the way we both liked it and opened a bottle of wine that was probably too expensive for a casual Saturday night but felt appropriate for what we were celebrating. Halfway through dinner, Clara set down her fork and looked at me with an expression of careful observation. "You speak differently now," she said. Your voice carries confidence that wasn't there before. You don't apologize before making statements. You don't qualify everything with maybe, or I think, or if that makes sense. You just say what you mean. I thought about that, recognizing the truth in her observation. Somewhere in the process of fighting for recognition, I had stopped seeking permission to take up space. The shift had been so gradual I had not noticed it happening until Clara named it. You've also stopped checking your phone constantly, Clara continued. When we're together now, you're actually here. Before, part of you was always somewhere else, anticipating William's needs or waiting for his approval or managing some invisible crisis only you could see. He was right. The hypervigilance that had defined my marriage had evaporated so completely I had not even registered its absence. I no longer jumped when notifications arrived. I no longer lived in anticipation of someone else's requirements or moods or demands. Clara raised her wine glass. To the woman you're becoming. She's pretty remarkable. I raised my glass to meet hers, feeling emotion tighten in my throat. To family who sees you even when you're disappearing. Beyond the emotional processing and settlement negotiations, there remained the mundane but necessary work of actual separation. I found a one-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood across town that I had always liked but had never lived in because William preferred areas closer to his office. The apartment had tall windows that let in good light and a small balcony where I could drink morning coffee while watching the neighborhood wake up. Moving became an exercise in intentional selection. I went through our shared household systematically, taking only what I needed and leaving behind anything that felt contaminated by who I had been in that marriage. The expensive dishes we had received as wedding gifts stayed. The artwork William had chosen for the walls stayed. The furniture that had been arranged to accommodate his preferences stayed. I took my grandmother's quilt, my books, my coffee maker, and the few items that felt truly mine rather than ours. The apartment looked spare when I finished moving in, almost empty, but the emptiness felt clean rather than lacking. This was space waiting to be filled with choices I made for myself. I opened a new bank account in my name alone, establishing financial infrastructure completely separate from anything William had access to or knowledge of. I applied for a credit card that would build credit history independent of our shared accounts. I changed my mailing address and set up utilities and created systems for managing my life that did not require anyone's input or approval but my own. Each practical task felt like reclamation. Like building foundation for a life where I was the architect rather than the supporting structure for someone else's vision. The work was tedious, paperwork and phone calls and small decisions about internet providers and renters insurance, but it was satisfying in a way that surprised me. This was concrete evidence that I was constructing something new rather than just escaping something painful. On my first night in the apartment, I sat on the floor with takeout Chinese food because I had not yet bought furniture for the living room, and felt something close to peace. The space was mine. The choices were mine. The future, whatever shape it took, would be built by me. The apartment felt different 6 months later. What had started as sparse and nearly empty had gradually filled with intentional choices. A dining table I bought from a local craftsman who made furniture by hand. Bookshelves assembled on a Saturday afternoon while Clara provided commentary and wine. Artwork from a gallery opening Rebecca had invited me to, pieces that spoke to me rather than matching some predetermined aesthetic William would have approved. I stood at that dining table on a Tuesday morning, my laptop open to business planning documents I had been refining for weeks. Hamilton Strategic Partners. The name felt right. My name, my work, my identity separate from anyone else's shadow. The consulting practice I was building focused on something I had discovered I was genuinely skilled at. Helping executives develop the strategic relationship management abilities that separated good careers from exceptional ones. My first 3 clients had come through referrals from William's former colleagues, people who had witnessed what I contributed and wanted similar support for their own professional trajectories. The irony was not lost on me. The skills I had downplayed as merely supportive for 15 years translated directly into marketable professional expertise that people were willing to pay substantial fees to access. I understood client psychology in ways that went beyond surface-level networking. I could read a room and identify which relationships needed nurturing, which partnerships had untapped potential, which connections were transactional and which could become genuinely collaborative. I knew how to build authentic relationships that served business objectives without feeling manipulative or performative. I could provide strategic advice that considered both professional goals and human complexity. The work satisfied me in ways I had not anticipated. The recognition was explicit rather than implied. The compensation was fair rather than invisible. The credit for success belonged unambiguously to me. When clients thanked me for helping them navigate difficult professional relationships or secure important partnerships, they were thanking me directly. My name appeared on invoices and contracts and acknowledgments. I was building something that could not be erased or attributed to someone else's genius. The workshop idea emerged from a conversation with Rebecca over coffee. She had mentioned that her company was looking for someone to facilitate a session on professional partnership dynamics, and wondered if I would be interested. I developed a 2-hour workshop that opened with my story, the celebration dinner, the toast that reduced 15 years of partnership to a punchline, the decision to walk away with dignity intact. The response surprised me with its intensity. The first workshop I delivered had 20 participants. Half of them stayed after to share their own stories of invisible labor, of contributions that went unacknowledged, of feeling essential yet somehow also expendable. Several asked if I offered individual coaching. 3 requested that I deliver the same workshop for their organizations. I refined the content and began offering the workshop monthly. The audiences grew. Ambitious professionals who wanted to avoid taking their support systems for granted. Partners who had been providing invisible labor and needed permission to advocate for themselves. Managers who were trying to create workplace cultures that acknowledged all forms of contribution. My talks always opened with the dinner story. I told them about sitting 3 feet away from William while he announced to 30 people that I had no ambition, no plan, that I was just living off his success. I described the choice I made in that moment. Not to shrink or explode or laugh along with my own degradation, but to claim dignity and walk away from anything that required me to be invisible. People responded to the honesty. After each workshop, attendees lined up to talk with me. They shared their experiences. They asked for advice about documentation and boundaries and recognizing their own worth. They expressed gratitude for validating feelings they thought were unreasonable or selfish. A woman in her 40s told me she had been editing her husband's academic papers for 20 years while he published under his name alone. A man in his 30s described managing all the social infrastructure for his wife's medical practice while she told colleagues she was too busy for personal networking. A younger woman explained how her partner took credit for business ideas she contributed during their evening conversations. I realized my revenge had never been about destroying William. It was about reclaiming narrative control. About ensuring the story of our marriage included accurate accounting of who built what. It was about refusing to let my contributions be erased from history simply because they happened behind the scenes. 10 months after the dinner, I received an email from the organizers of the Women's Leadership Summit, a regional conference that drew several hundred attendees annually. They had heard about my workshops and wanted to know if I would be interested in delivering the keynote address on navigating professional partnerships and maintaining identity within supportive roles. I accepted before allowing myself to feel the fear that came with the invitation. This was not a small workshop with 20 people. This was a stage with professional lighting and hundreds of women who would be expecting substance and insight and clarity. I prepared for weeks, refining my talk until every word felt deliberate and earned. The night before the conference, I barely slept, running through the speech in my mind and questioning whether I had the authority to stand on that stage and speak about these topics. The morning of the keynote, I stood backstage listening to my introduction. The conference organizer listed my credentials: founder of Hamilton Strategic Partners, consultant to executives at major firms, specialist in strategic relationship management and invisible labor recognition. The words sounded foreign, like she was describing someone else. But they were describing me. This was who I had become. I walked onto that stage and the lights were bright enough that I could only see the first few rows clearly. Hundreds of faces looking up at me with expectation and attention. I took a breath and began speaking. I told them about the dinner. About the toast. About the decision to walk away. I explained what I learned about boundaries and documentation and the simple assertion that I would not participate in my own erasure anymore. I talked about discovering that being supportive never required being invisible, that partnership meant mutual recognition rather than one person's sacrifice enabling another person's glory. The applause that followed felt different than workshop feedback. It was louder, more sustained, carrying weight that made my chest tighten with emotion I had not expected. When the sound finally faded and women began lining up to speak with me, I understood something fundamental. My choice to walk away from that dinner had ripple effects I could not have predicted. Other women were watching. They were taking notes about what dignity looked like. They were finding courage to examine their own situations and advocate for themselves. A woman with gray hair and kind eyes told me she had been supporting her husband's political career for 30 years while he introduced her at events as just my wife. She was going to start documenting her contributions tomorrow. A younger woman explained she had been about to accept a marriage proposal from someone who regularly dismissed her career ambitions. After hearing my talk, she realized she needed to have some difficult conversations before making that commitment. An executive in her 50s said she had been minimizing her assistant's contributions in exactly the ways I described. She was going to change how she acknowledged the work that made her own work possible. That night, back in my apartment, I sat at my dining table reviewing the calendar on my laptop. It was full of consulting appointments, workshop bookings, speaking invitations. Work I had chosen. Compensation I had negotiated. Recognition I had earned on my own terms. On the wall across from my desk hung a framed photograph from the conference. I was mid-speech, caught in a moment of gesturing to emphasize some point, with hundreds of attentive faces visible in the audience. Under the photo I had written a single line in clean black ink. Walked away, built better. Nothing about my new life was fragile or uncertain. Not my income, which came from clients who valued my expertise and paid fair rates for it. Not my reputation, which was built on work I could document and claim without qualification. Not my sense of self-worth, which no longer depended on someone else's acknowledgement or approval. William had thought that toast would get laughs at my expense. What it actually did was give me perfect clarity about who I had been allowing myself to become and who I was capable of being instead. The humiliation that was meant to put me in my place had instead shown me I deserved a different place entirely. The revenge that mattered most was not his suffering but my thriving. Not destruction but construction. Not bitterness but the clean satisfaction of knowing I had reclaimed every piece of myself he tried to diminish. I thought about the woman I had been at that dinner, wearing her carefully chosen navy dress and folded hands, waiting to see if she would crumble or explode under the weight of public humiliation. I wished I could tell her what I knew now. That walking away was just the beginning. That dignity was not about performing grace under pressure but about refusing to accept pressure that was designed to make you small. That the last joke had been his, but every achievement after would be entirely hers. My phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. She had just told her husband she was starting her own consulting practice and would no longer be providing unpaid support for his business. She included 3 exclamation points and a note that she had set up an appointment with Janet for next week. I smiled and replied with encouragement, then set my phone aside and returned to the business plan on my laptop. I had a new workshop to develop, this one focused on recognizing and compensating invisible labor in professional partnerships. The irony of building a career on expertise gained from 15 years of unpaid work was not lost on me. But irony was just another word for lessons learned the hard way. I was building something no one could take credit for because my name was on it in ink they could not erase. The foundation was mine. The structure was mine. The success, whatever form it ultimately took, would be mine alone. And that knowledge was worth more than any toast, any promotion, any validation William could have offered me at that dinner. I had walked away. And I had built better. If this story of quiet strength and calculated justice resonated with you, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Zoe raised her wine glass at that dinner table and calmly said, "This is the last joke you'll ever make at my expense," before walking away with perfect dignity. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more powerful stories of people reclaiming their worth. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.